How do you force an occupier out of your territory? In the mainland, Ukraine has provided the big answer to that question by meeting Russia's invading forces with a fierce defense and, at times, launching counteroffensives to retake what Russia attempts to steal. However, Crimea is a different story. Ukraine isn't fighting directly on the peninsula. Instead, its strategy is much simpler. Make life so difficult for the 800,000 or so Russians who have moved to Crimea that they have to leave and Putin loses control. October 13th saw Ukraine take another step toward executing that strategy. A giant fireball has erupted over Crimea as Ukraine just broke Russia's backbone. That fireball, the Kyiv Independent reports, was a result of Ukrainian drones striking the largest Russian oil depot in the Crimean city of Feodosia. The strike, which took place overnight on October 13th, was part of a wider strike against several targets in Crimea, and it caused a blaze so massive that Russia couldn't cover up the reality of what really happened. And how could that blaze not be massive? As an unnamed source from Ukraine's security service, or SBU, told the Kyiv Independent, Ukraine's drones took out several massive fuel tanks in one sitting. Drones hit at least 5 tanks. A large-scale fire is recorded on the territory of the oil depot, the source said. And we don't have to take their word for it. There is also footage that is already circulating on social media showing the sheer scale of the blaze that Ukraine sparked. One of those videos has been shared by an unexpected source, a man named Jürgen Naudit, the managing director of an education company who makes it very clear that he stands for Ukraine in his X biography, shared a 5-second clip to X. Feodosia will not receive any gasoline, Naudit says gleefully, while adding that Russia's oil depot had intercepted several Ukrainian drones. That's one way to handle drones, we suppose. Rather than shoot them out of the sky, intercept them with the very targets that Ukraine wants to hit. The shared footage showcases a ferocious blaze, causing massive plumes of smoke to rise into the air. It also looks like it was shot from the window of a building in the city of Feodosia, revealing that Ukraine's strike was so significant that its aftermath could be seen from inside the city itself. More footage is shared by The Sun's YouTube channel, including the 5-second clip Naudit posted to his X account. The Sun also offers a second piece of footage, seemingly shot using a cell phone, that showcases the same scene. The Feodosia oil depot is consumed by flames and smoke billows into the sky. We mentioned earlier that Russia does its best to cover up incidents like this. It can't succeed with what just happened at Feodosia. To make matters worse for Russia, the October 13th strike is one that it should have seen coming. At the very least, Russia should have had more air defenses capable of shooting down drones installed at the depot, because it's not like Russia wasn't warned. Ukraine didn't tell Russia that it was going to target the depot in words, it did it through action, as October 13th represents just one of several strikes against the depot in the last several weeks. The Crimean Wind Telegram channel says that this is the second time Ukraine has hit the Feodosia oil depot in the space of a week. Around midnight, the Feodosia marine oil terminal was set on fire for the second time in the past 7 days, the channel reports. It also offers a few more details about the sheer scale of the blaze. The oil depot burning in Feodosia is clearly visible from space, according to the Crimean Wind Monitoring Group, citing satellite imagery. The scale of the fire is impressive. Thermal signatures show plumes of scorching air above the city and the sea. We said this was a big fire. Apparently, it was big enough to be visible from space. Twice in a week clearly wasn't enough for Ukraine, though. As Euromaidan Press points out in its report on Ukraine's October 13th strike, this is actually the third time that Ukraine has hit the depot in recent memory. Beyond the 2 October strikes, there was another on September 29th. It also notes that the second Feodosia depot strike appears to have been timed to coincide with Vladimir Putin's birthday, which is a clear attempt by Ukraine to send a message. Oil is burning in Crimea, and it seems like there's nothing that Putin can do about it. If there was, Russia wouldn't have let Ukraine hit the depot 3 times in a little over 2 weeks. Each of these strikes has been successful, with each also gradually chipping away at the fuel reserves being stored at the Feodosia depot. Euromaidan Press says that the depot was home to 34 fuel reservoirs before Ukraine started its targeted campaign. There are now only 22 left, and it seems likely that Ukraine will target the depot again before too long. Why wouldn't it? The October 13th strike destroyed 5 of the reservoirs, meaning the 2 earlier strikes managed to take out 7 between them. Russia was unable to stop any of these strikes, and the remaining reservoirs represent big enough targets that Ukraine will think it can hit them again and again. Slowly but surely, Ukraine is chipping away at the Feodosia depot. It won't be long before there's no oil left. The one caveat to all of this is that there is no official word from Ukraine that it carried out the strike, per Newsweek's report on the incident. That's not unusual for strikes involving the SBU. The organization wants to keep its methods a secret from Russia, so it often collectively keeps its mouth shut when major strikes like this occur. When Russia has no official information at all, it's even less likely to be able to conduct the types of air defenses needed to protect Feodosia from future strikes. Ukraine has already taken advantage of these failures 3 times, and it will want to preserve any opportunity it has to do it again. There is at least some level of confirmation, first from the source who spoke to the Kyiv Independent, and then from Russia itself. Beyond the statement in which the source revealed that the SBU had hit 5 Feodosia tanks, the source also made it clear that the SBU was behind the entire strike. The SBU continues to systematically reduce the enemy's military, logistical, and economic capacity to wage war against Ukraine, the source told the Kyiv Independent. That's another standard line from Ukraine. It's been targeting resources, particularly energy-related ones, inside Russia and occupied territory for most of 2025. With each fuel tank burned, Russia has a little less oil it can use on the front lines, serve to its people, or sell to generate money needed for Putin's war. Just as the repeated strikes on Feodosia show Ukraine chipping away at the facility, the wider campaign sees the country chipping away at an oil industry that is absolutely vital for Russia's survival. As for Russia, it's trotted out some of its usual excuses, along with the tactics that it often uses to try to prevent news of such devastating strikes from reaching everyday Russians. In Feodosia, Euromaidan press reports, Ukraine's strikes were powerful enough to disrupt public transportation routes. Train services were delayed for several hours, and the Feodosia authorities made internet service unavailable on the morning after the attack. A common tactic by Russia, limiting internet service makes it more difficult to share real-time footage of a strike or its aftermath. It doesn't stop footage from emerging before the shutdown, as we saw from the videos mentioned earlier, and the internet is eventually restored, enabling sharing once more. Still, it's all a part of Russia's disinformation campaign that it hopes will hide the truth of what happened at Feodosia. Another part of that disinformation campaign is the claim that we've heard many times before. It wasn't drones scoring direct hits that caused the blaze at the Feodosia fuel depot, Russia tries to claim. Rather, these fires occur as a result of Russia being so effective at shooting Ukraine's drones out of the sky. It never makes sense, but it's all Russia has going for it. This time, it was the Russian-appointed Minister of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, who came up with the excuses. As a result, a fire started. There are no casualties according to current information. All relevant services are already working on the site. Preliminary reports indicate that the air defenses shot down more than 20 unmanned aircraft, Aksyonov said in a statement. Note the focus on unmanned aircraft being shot down rather than scoring any direct hits. Russia wants the people who read these statements to believe that the aftermath of Ukraine's drone strikes is caused by debris falling out of the sky rather than Ukraine hitting its targets. That isn't the case, of course. But unless Russia feels it can frame Ukraine's achievements as terrorist attacks, it will always focus on shooting drones down rather than those drones doing what Ukraine sent them to do. We can take Aksionov's words as official confirmation that Ukraine took out 5 fuel tanks at Feodosia. A fire started is an understated way of confirming the massive inferno we see in the footage from the site. The Kyiv Independent adds more figures to Russia's interception claims. According to the outlet, Russia's defense ministry has confirmed that what happened in Feodosia was part of a larger series of strikes that Russia supposedly thwarted. Ukraine sent 103 drones into Russian and occupied territories, the ministry says, all of which were intercepted. Around 40 of those drones went to Crimea, suggesting that the 20 that Aksyonov mentions are just part of a larger horde. We'll come back to that point in a moment. First, let's zoom in a little closer on the Feodosia depot that Ukraine has targeted so many times over the last couple of weeks. We already know that it's the largest depot in the city and that it's rapidly running out of the fuel reserves Russia stores there due to Ukraine's strikes. The Kyiv Independent adds that the depot is located around 155 miles away from Ukrainian-controlled territory, putting it well in range of Ukraine's drones and even some of its long-range missiles. The depot can hold up to 250,000 tons of fuel, much of which goes towards supporting Russia's forces. However, the depot is also a multifunctional facility, the outlet says. It's also used to support the transshipment of Russia's oil products between sea vessels, rail tankers, and road transport. So Ukraine didn't just take out fuel on October 13th. It caused a fire so massive that it'll likely shut down a key logistical hub in Feodosia. Now that we know that the depot can hold 250,000 tons of fuel, we can also do some maths to determine just how much fuel Russia has lost thanks to Ukraine's repeated strikes. We mentioned earlier that Feodosia is usually home to 34 fuel reservoirs, and that only 22 remain after Ukraine's 3 strikes. Assuming each of those reservoirs holds an equal amount, that means each one can store a touch over 7,350 tons of fuel. Feodosia has lost 12 of its reservoirs, which amounts to 88,235 tons of fuel that has burned thanks to Ukraine. That's a lot of fuel that isn't going to make it to the front lines. A little while ago, we mentioned that Russia claims to have shot down 40 drones over Crimea, with 20 of those drones apparently being taken out in Feodosia. That implies that Feodosia's fuel depot wasn't Ukraine's only target on October 13th, and it wasn't. There were two others, both of which are also part of Russia's energy infrastructure, though they serve different purposes than the oil depot. Militarny has the details in an October 13th report. It highlights that the open-source intelligence telegram channel Dnipro Osint has revealed that Ukraine also managed to hit a pair of electrical substations. The first was in Simferopol, where Ukraine took out a 330 kilovolt substation, with the second being a 220 kilovolt substation in Kaffa. The latter has been confirmed by NASA's FIRMS satellite monitoring system, the outlet reports. These substations play a crucial role in occupied Crimea's power setup, Militarny says. They're part of what it calls a power bridge to Crimea that includes several overhead cable transmission lines that connect Crimea to the Russian region of Krasnodar Krai via the Kerch Strait. These power lines connect to substations inside Crimea, from which electricity is distributed through the Crimean peninsula. So Ukraine didn't just take out Russian oil on October 13th. It also tried to cut the power to Crimea, giving the occupying citizens a little taste of what Russia is doing to Ukraine's people. This was an eye for an eye. After all, Russia's attacks have been causing power outages all across Ukraine. Pravda reported on these outages on the same day that Ukraine launched its aerial assault on Crimea, noting that the regions of Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk have been forced to introduce controlled emergency power outages. Sumy, Poltava, and Kirovograd are also dealing with these outages, as are Kharkiv, Chernihiv, and Zaporizhia. Ukraine is trying to hit Russian citizens where it hurts, without killing those civilians with its strikes. Taking out electrical substations in Crimea is a good way to do that, as is destroying fuel reserves stored on the peninsula. That brings us to what all of this means for the Ukraine war moving forward. It would be inaccurate to claim that this is a game-changing attack by Ukraine, no matter how massive the blaze it caused ended up being. This is a death by 1,000 cuts strategy Ukraine is implementing, and the loss of more fuel reservoirs at Feodosia is part of a much wider plan that will eventually force Putin to give up his Ukraine invasion because Russia lacks the resources to complete the takeover of Ukraine. This is more fuel lost for Russia, and it's happened at a time when Russia can ill afford to be losing yet more fuel. Ukraine has launched a concerted campaign against Russia's oil refining and its refined oil products, which include gasoline and petrol over the last couple of months. By October 10th, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Alexander Syrsky, was hailing Ukraine's achievements in that area. Via a Facebook post, Syrsky said, "Last month, the number of hits on the territory of the Russian Federation was brought to 70. The production of fuels and lubricants, explosives, and other components of the Russian military-industrial complex is being destroyed in the aggressor country. In particular, oil refining in Russia has been reduced by 21%. It's the 70 strikes leading to a 21% reduction in Russia's oil processing that will worry Putin most. It could even be that 21% is an understatement." Just a few days before Syrsky's Facebook post, reports were circulating that Ukraine had shut down about 38% of Russia's oil refining. Whether it's just over a fifth or almost 2/5, the number is far too high for comfort from the Russian perspective. We're also seeing the impact these strikes are having on Russia. As the Kyiv Independent reported on October 8th, Russia has been experiencing gasoline shortages to the point where it's been forced to implement restrictions in several regions. Occupied Crimea is among them, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Other regions experiencing major shortages include Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and Tyumen, all of which have implemented fuel caps that see customers only being able to buy a fraction of the gasoline they'd need to fill a vehicle's tank. CNN adds that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has claimed that Russia is now short about 20% of the gasoline that it needs to fulfill the country's domestic needs. Coming back to Crimea, Ukraine is targeting the region specifically for a couple of reasons. We've touched on one of those reasons already. Ukraine wants to make sure that Russian citizens feel the pain that Putin is attempting to inflict on Ukraine. Crimea is a particular sore spot for Ukraine, given that the Russian citizens living there only arrived since 2014, which is when Russia annexed the Crimean peninsula. October 13th saw the latest attempt Ukraine has made to bring that pain to Russia, and it will likely lead to yet more fuel shortages in the peninsula that is racked by them. The Kyiv Independent highlighted these Crimean shortage issues in its report on Ukraine's October 6th strike against Feodosia. It says that a Russian business outlet named Kommersant ran an in-depth examination of 17,000 gas stations throughout Russia's southern federal district. Occupied Crimea is part of that district, and it's been hit hard by gasoline shortages. Around 50% of the gas stations in occupied Crimea and Sevastopol have been forced to halt sales altogether in the wake of Ukraine's repeated attacks. Yet more fuel tanks being taken out will only add to that problem. After all, losing fuel that was meant for the Russian military will force Putin to draw deeper from reserves initially intended for Crimea's people. As those reserves deplete, more gas stations will be forced to shut down or place even stricter restrictions on the Crimean population. However, there's another reason why Ukraine is targeting Crimea with these types of attacks. Crimea is extremely important to Putin, and he wants to ensure Russia maintains control over the peninsula. A large part of maintaining that control comes from the 800,000 Russian citizens who have moved to Crimea since Russia annexed the peninsula. Without those citizens, Putin will struggle to claim that Crimea should rightfully belong to Russia. Herein lies the brilliance of what Ukraine is doing. By conducting such regular strikes against Crimea, it's sending a message to the people that Putin sent to live on the peninsula. They aren't safe anymore, their fuel is being taken away from them, and no matter how much Russia tries to hide it, reports about Ukrainian drone attacks are constant. Putin seems to be able to do nothing about any of this, despite moving more air defenses to Crimea. Eventually, Ukraine hopes something is going to break in the Russian population that lives on the peninsula. They may end up wanting to go back to the Russian mainland. At least there, they won't be subjected to weekly airstrikes against military targets near their homes, and could perhaps even avoid the fuel restrictions that are running rampant in Crimea. Escape may now be on the minds of many of Crimea's Russians, and that's terrible news for Putin. He needs his people to stay put so he can claim control. Ukraine wants them to run, and it's going to keep on hitting Crimea until they do. Right now, Ukraine wants Crimea's Russian population to know that the clock is ticking on their ability to leave. That was suggested by Refat Chabarov, who is the chairman of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people. On June 3rd, Pravda reported that Chabarov had recorded a statement intended for the ears of Crimea's Russian occupiers. As you are already beginning to realize, the illegally built Kerch bridge that connects occupied Crimea to the territory of the aggressor country, Russia, will soon be destroyed, Chabarov said. That claim followed a June 3rd strike on the Kerch bridge by the SBU. Chabarov continued stating, "And you may find yourselves trapped in a kind of pocket. That's why I strongly recommend you urgently leave the peninsula and go back home to Russia, to the places from which you illegally arrived in occupied Crimea. In other words, get out while you still can." Ukraine has been destroying Russia's tanks by the bucket load. A staggering 11,256 of them have been taken out as of October 14th, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. But Vladimir Putin, in his infinite wisdom, thought he had it all figured out. Ukraine was just destroying the Soviet-era tanks, the ones that were meant to burn through Ukraine's ammunition rather than make a real dent in its defenses. Putin was keeping Russia's best tanks away from Ukraine. Finally, Russia's leader unleashed those tanks on Pokrovsk, and in no time at all, Ukraine proved that they were no better than the tanks that Russia had already lost. Russia saved its best tanks for a year, only for Ukraine to crush them in minutes. For almost a year, Russia carefully stockpiled every T-90M tank that it was building, knowing that it had special plans in place for those tanks. That's according to David Axe, writing for Euromaidan Press, who says that Putin was planning a major mechanized assault on the Donetsk Oblast with Russia's T-90Ms. Those tanks were supposed to finish off the last of Ukraine's resistance, allowing Russia to finally claim the key logistical city of Pokrovsk that Putin originally thought his troops would take during the summer. Russia's soldiers failed. The T-90Ms would finish the job. And Putin had every reason to believe that the T-90M was the right tank to finally take Pokrovsk. After all, it's Russia's most modern battle tank, and has been hailed by Putin himself as the best tank in the world. Russia's leader said as much in June 2023, with TASS reporting Putin as claiming, "It can be said today that the T-90M Proriev is the world's best tank. As soon as it approaches positions, no chance is left for anyone or anything. It fires into a longer range and more accurately, it also has better protection." Keep that quote in mind. Ukraine proved it wrong on October 9th in devastating fashion. The T-90M's reported specifications certainly seem to lend credence to Putin's claims. Army recognition says the tank packs the kind of punch Putin claims it has, thanks to a 125mm 2A46M4 smoothbore gun that's capable of firing both standard ammunition and anti-tank guided missiles. Depending on the types of round used, the gun can hit targets at a range of up to about 13,120 feet, with its missiles traveling even further, 16,400 feet, thanks to a laser beam riding-based guidance system. Add a PKT 7.62mm coaxial machine gun into the mix, and you get a tank that can shred through infantry and destroy almost any armor that it comes across, or so Russia claims. It's also a fairly agile tank. The T-90M can hit a top speed of around 37.2 miles per hour and can travel for 341 miles before it needs to refuel. Russia has the option of carrying a pair of diesel fuel tanks under the hull's rear, which allows for refueling in the field and possible extension of this maximum range. Protection comes from the Relict system, which is a form of explosive reactive armor that's supposed to protect the T-90M's front and turret from blasts. Russia also installs a Q-net armor kit onto the tank's hull and rear, which is designed to protect the T-90M against rocket-propelled grenades. It all adds up to an impressive tank, at least on paper. Putin's problem is simple. What looks great on paper doesn't always end up being able to perform when it's put to the test on the battlefield. In the T-90M's case, a lot of firepower and protection against explosions doesn't mean much when Ukraine brings so many different types of weapons to a fight. Still, Putin thought he had the right tank for launching a new mechanized assault near Pokrovsk on October 9th. This assault would see Russia reverting to type after spending the summer sending small groups of infantry to infiltrate settlements around Pokrovsk. Russia's target, Axe explains, was the small village of Shakova, and he'd amassed an intimidating force. The village, which is located about 12.4 miles north of Pokrovsk, was to be subjected to 36 Russian tanks, including plenty of T-90Ms and armored fighting vehicles, in addition to 40 motorcycle troops. Axe notes that Shakova is also an anchor for Ukraine's defenses that lie east of a 24.8-mile salient that Russia managed to carve through Ukraine's defenses in the Pokrovsk direction during the summer. Russia's objective was clear. If it could overrun Shakova with this mechanized assault, it will be able to embed its troops into the village. With fortification complete, Shakova could then be used as a launching pad for future assaults that would take Russia closer to and eventually into Pokrovsk. On October 9th, that mechanized force launched its attack. The outcome was brutal for Russia. Ukraine was prepared for everything that Russia was going to throw at it on October 9th. Shakova was already home to Ukraine's 225th Assault Regiment. Their numbers have been supplemented by operatives from the notorious 1st Azov Corps, which spent the latter part of the summer coordinating the retaking of several settlements near Pokrovsk from Russia. Those two units worked together to construct a defense that would overcome Russia's mechanized assault. The assault came in waves, as the 1st Azov Corps recounted in a telegram post in the battle's aftermath. The enemy carried out offensive actions in several waves and from different directions, the group said. Initially, groups of motorcyclists advanced, followed by columns of armored vehicles, tanks and armored personnel carriers with infantry. That seems like a Putin-approved approach. Rather than sending the tanks and armored vehicles in first, Russia sent in its vulnerable motorcycle troops to soak up Ukraine's ammunition. The idea may have been to leave Ukraine's defenses without the ammo needed to take on the tanks that followed. Instead, as Russia attempted to advance in waves, mines, drones and artillery stopped the mechanized assault in its tracks. Ukraine managed to hit 20 of Russia's vehicles, including a trio of its tanks, in a defensive bombardment that forced Russia's forces to scatter back to the contested village of Volodymyrivka. That village, which is just south of Shakova, was then targeted throughout the night of October 9th and into 10th by Ukrainian bomber drones, which were deployed to pick off any survivors. There were no Russian forces left in Volodymyrivka by the end of the night, and the numbers make for terrible reading for Putin. By the end of the assault, Russia had lost 3 of its tanks, 16 of its armored fighting vehicles, and 41 motorcycles. 2 more light vehicles were also destroyed, the 1st Azov Corps says. It's unclear what these light vehicles were, however, Russia has a track record of sending civilian vehicles into assaults against Ukraine, to the point where Axe reports in a separate article that civilian cars now make up 90% of Russia's vehicle losses in Ukraine. So it's possible that some of Putin's soldiers had even worse protection than that offered by the T-90M tanks and armored vehicles of which Russia is so proud. Speaking of Russia's soldiers, they had a very bad day on October 9th. The 1st Azov Corps says that confirmed enemy losses amounted to 107 irreversible and 51 medical. We can assume that means 107 dead and 51 injured, which accounts for the majority of the troops Russia sent to assault Shakova. Axe adds that it isn't clear which of Russia's units it dedicated to the mechanized assault. However, it's possible that the soldiers were part of the 5 Marine brigades that Russia sent to Pokrovsk in response to Ukraine's deployment of the 1st Azov Corps in the region. If that's the case, the Russian troops that died in droves in the Shakova attack were among the best that Russia has to offer outside of its special forces. Even Russia's best can't do much when the tanks they drive aren't as good as their leader claims them to be. What happened on October 9th was a humiliation for Russia. For months, Russia kept its best tanks off the battlefield, confident that those tanks were finally in a position to succeed. They were deployed alongside other armored vehicles and dozens of soldiers. This was an assault literally a year in the making, and Ukraine shut it down in devastating fashion, requiring less than a day to do so. Putin just relearned a valuable lesson on October 9th. Ukraine has all of the answers for dealing with Russia's mechanized assaults. Russia's leader will now be left asking himself the question of how this all happened. And the answer comes down to the tank that he himself has revered for so long. The reality that Putin is now realizing is that the T-90M is far from the tank he claims it to be. Rather, it's yet another relic of the Soviet era that has been dressed up for the modern day and is being paraded as the world's best tank, even as results show that it doesn't deserve that distinction. The T-90M is simply a symptom of Russia's overconfidence in the outdated technology that it still uses. That overconfidence was on perfect display as recently as May 2025. After delivering a new batch of T-90Ms to the military, the tank's manufacturer, Russia's state-owned Rostec, was very keen to extol its virtues. The Russian T-90M, T-72B3M, and T-80BVM are vehicles best suited for present-day conditions of combat, Rostec's first deputy CEO, Vladimir Artyakov, said in May. They can be considered as the world's best serial-produced tanks in terms of their aggregate characteristics. This is the result of the well-coordinated work by the large staff of Rostec enterprises, developers, designers, engineers and technologists, workers of industrial facilities and repair groups. We can understand the hyperbole around the T-90M. Russia needs everybody to believe that the tank is the world's best for propaganda and intimidation purposes, but the T-72 and the T-80, the old tanks that Ukraine has been destroying by the hundreds since Putin launched his invasion, those two tanks being entered into the conversation immediately casts doubt on how effective the T-90M can be given their poor performance in Ukraine. Still, doubt doesn't overcome the impressive specifications Russia offers up for its T-90M. The tank's terrible performance in Ukraine turns doubt into certainty. The T-90Ms that Russia stockpiled for its assault in Zhukova aren't the only ones that it has deployed into Ukraine during the war. They're just the latest, and just like those that came before, they have dramatically failed. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who's decided to look beyond Russia's specifications to find out what the T-90M is really all about. The Small Wars Journal highlights some of the problems with the T-90M that Russia has been hiding for decades. Yes, Russia's ultra-modern battle tank is actually decades old. Granted, it's not quite a Soviet-era tank, as it entered production in 1994. However, that production date means that the T-90M has existed for over 3 decades in one form or another. Plus, as the journal points out, the tank saw practically no combat action at all until Putin decided to launch the Ukraine invasion. What Russia really has on its hands in Ukraine is a tank that is being actively combat tested inside Ukraine, a tank that is coming up short in every single department. One of the few other times the T-90M was deployed before Ukraine was when it was used in Syria back in December 2015, the journal claims. One of the 6 tanks Syria received came up against several BGM-71 TOW anti-tank guided missiles, and it managed to survive the encounters. That would have raised Russia's confidence in its tank, though it also doesn't mean much from a modern perspective. BGM-71s are hardly the newest anti-tank weapons available. They've been in service since 1970, making them much older than the T-90M itself. You would expect Russia's best-in-the-world battle tank to be able to absorb hits from a weapon built 24 years before the tank was deployed. Russia's problem, as it discovered in Ukraine, is that the T-90M isn't capable of dealing with modern anti-tank missiles or the hordes of drones that Ukraine has built since 2022. Weaknesses abound in the design of Russia's supposedly world-beating tank. One of those weaknesses is a holdover from the T-72. That Soviet-era tank lacks the partition that separates its crew from the ammunition stored in the tank. Without that partition, the T-72's ammunition exploding destroys both tank and crew. The T-90M has the same lack of a partition, with Russia instead favoring a carousel that makes the tank a death trap if it's struck by a top-down weapon. Guess what Ukraine has? Drones, Javelin missiles, and several other anti-tank weapons against which the T-90M was completely untested before the Ukraine war exposed its fatal flaws. The best tank in the world still carries many of the Soviet-era design flaws that have led to so many thousands of its older brethren becoming little more than flaming wreckages on the Ukrainian battlefield. It's not just these types of structural design flaws that make the T-90M a far weaker tank than Russia claims. The tank is also plagued with technical issues. Take its turret, for instance. In addition to being vulnerable to top-down strikes, that turret also has an interesting design flaw. The flaw was exposed by Forbes in May 2022, which named the issue spinning turret syndrome. When the T-90M is hit in a certain way, its turret starts spinning around uncontrollably, making the tank's impressive firepower practically useless. There have been several examples of this fatal flaw being exposed by Ukraine. In January 2024, Ukraine managed to take out a T-90M using a pair of M2 Bradley vehicles that should, in theory, have been unable to penetrate the T-90M's armor. Spinning turret syndrome was the cause of the Russian tank's failure. Something similar was seen in December 2023, when one of Ukraine's first-person view or FPV drones scored a direct hit on the T-90M to send its turret into an uncontrollable spin that led to the crew losing control of the entire tank. And in May 2024, another T-90M tank struck by several of Ukraine's FPV drones ended up experiencing the same problem. The turret started rotating clockwise after the second drone strike, and as was the case with the other two incidents, the Russian crew was forced to abandon the tank. It should go without saying that a tank that is meant to be the best the world has ever seen shouldn't have this kind of technical problem. What use is armor that's capable of protecting the T-90M's crew when the tank itself becomes uncontrollable thanks to some kind of design flaw that should have been caught decades ago? We say should have. The reality is that Russia would never have even thought to look for this type of flaw because drone strikes weren't even a consideration when the T-90 entered production in 1994. And that brings us back to the point that this tank is not only far less modern than Russia tries to claim, but that it's also built on the back of outdated Soviet-era designs that aren't suitable for modern warfare. The national interest makes that clear in an article examining the T-90M's many failures before Ukraine wiped out several of them in a single day on October 9th. It notes that strategic mistakes were partly to blame for so many T-90Ms being taken out, as Russia was deploying them in urban regions that don't offer the space a tank needs to operate effectively. However, it was new weapons that were the main problem for Russia's tank. The advent of new threats appears to have rendered obsolete some of the defenses of the T-90. Loitering munitions such as the Lancet, as well as top-attack anti-tank guided munitions such as the US-made Javelin have so far proved effective against the Stora defense system, the national interest reports. Add drones to that list. Ukraine did, and it showed what these drones, along with mines and artillery, can do to Russia's T-90Ms on October 9th. Given that its most modern tank has failed so often in Ukraine, you would be forgiven for thinking that Russia is going to give up the ghost on the T-90M. You would be incorrect. Russia is not only going to keep on pushing with the tank, but it's also looking to boost its stockpiles even further. Whether it can or not is another matter. In June, United 24 media reported that Russia was significantly expanding the production of the T-90M. It quoted the Conflict Intelligence Team, which claims that Russia managed to build between 280 and 300 of these tanks in 2024, which represented a marked increase on the numbers built in previous years. There were between 60 and 70 T-90Ms made in 2022, followed by Russia building between 140 and 180 of the tanks the following year. The thing is, that supposed mass production isn't going to do much to replace the enormous numbers of tanks Russia has lost in Ukraine. We told you in the introduction to this video that Ukraine claims to have destroyed 11,251 of Russia's tanks. That amounts to about 3,000 per year, so a T-90M production schedule that only produces a tenth of that number isn't going to worry Ukraine when it's already proven many times, and again on October 9th, that it can destroy T-90Ms just as easily as it takes out Russia's older tanks. So why is Russia trying to mass-produce the T-90M when it's clearly a failure? United 24 media hints that Russia is trying to stockpile for the future. Whether that means it's rebuilding its tank stock or it's getting ready for a time when it'll be able to start selling the T-90M isn't clear. Perhaps that means the T-90Ms Russia deployed to Shkova were pulled from the stockpiles Russia is trying to save because of the combination of past tank losses and the country's failure to take Pokrovsk during the summer. We can't say for sure. But what does seem more certain is that Russia may have a very hard time selling T-90Ms after Ukraine. Frankly, it was having a hard enough time even before the war started. Russia seemed to be onto a winner back in 2019. That's when India committed to buying 469 T-90Ms in an order that Meta Defense estimated to be worth about $2 billion. That amounts to a per-unit cost of over $4.2 million, which may make it clear why Russia is trying to mass-produce the T-90. Earning over $1 billion per year from 280 to 300 of these tanks would be helpful, given that Putin is spending billions on the Ukraine war. However, India wasn't happy with the T-90s it received from Russia. By September 2020, the tank was being criticized for its poor performance. Global Defense Corps also adds that the Indian Army used the T-90s it had back in 2017 as part of a Russian tank biathlon that included 19 countries. India lost that biathlon because its T-90s malfunctioned. By 2024, the national interest was reporting that India was rebuilding its T-90s almost from the ground up to make them tanks that could actually be usable in modern warfare. And a couple of years prior, Global Defense Corps said that India had ditched future plans to buy T-90s, preferring instead the French Leclerc tank. Much of this happened before Putin started the war in Ukraine. In other words, the T-90M was already seen as a failure by one of Russia's main weapons customers long before it proved itself to be one in Ukraine. All of this brings us back to October 9th and what Ukraine achieved against Russia's mechanized assault. The T-90M's faults were again on display, as it not only failed to help Russia complete that assault, but was also so powerless against Ukraine's drones, mines and artillery that the assault lasted for less than a day. Russia will likely continue to deploy T-90Ms from its stockpiles. Ukraine will just keep destroying them, turning the world's best tank into little more than an afterthought on the battlefield.
All hope is lost. That's the message coming from the Russian soldiers who are currently fighting against Ukraine in the Unakivka pocket in Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. Those troops are starving. They're running out of supplies and equipment. Nothing they can do can save them from the Ukrainian onslaught. And Vladimir Putin doesn't care. Far from doing whatever he can to save his soldiers in Sumy, Putin has abandoned his own troops. Surrounded and doomed, those soldiers have been left to die in Ukraine's kill zone. That's according to Euromaidan Press, which published a report on October 12 that covers what's happening in Unakivka and how Putin, along with the rest of the Russians' military top brass, is doing nothing to stop it. The outlet reports that Ukraine has come up with a clever strategy to deal with the Russian forces that have been attempting to create a buffer zone within Sumy since the beginning of summer. Rather than taking on those Russian forces head-on, Ukraine is instead creating fire pockets. These pockets are essentially kill zones, though not in the way one might expect. Unakivka has become another of those fire pockets, as Ukraine has encircled the Russian soldiers in that village. It might seem logical that Ukraine would assault Russia's soldiers once the village was encircled. However, that isn't what it's doing. Instead, Euromaidan Press reports, Ukraine is playing the long game by cutting off all supply routes into Unakivka so Russia can do nothing to save the soldiers it sent into the village. Not that it would, but that point will be addressed later in the video. Ukraine's tactic seems to be to drive the encircled Russian soldiers crazy, with a strategy that's leading to Russian soldiers killing their own comrades for attempting to surrender. Desperation is now king in Unakivka. It's all thanks to a simple formula, as Euromaidan Press reports. Take the Russian ground lines of communication under fire control, isolate and starve the Russians in Unakivka, and then turn the trap into a kill zone without any chances of evacuation or rotation. It's that formula, and it's working like a dream. Ukraine is playing on a major fault in the Russian military's hierarchy. Surrendering any territory that's been captured is a no-go for Russia's commanders, not least because they'd have to explain what happened to Putin. So, trapped in Ukraine's Unakivka kill zone, Russia's commanders won't allow their soldiers to surrender. They should die instead, just as they're doing. Choking off Russian supply lines is a common Ukrainian tactic, and it's been using that tactic a lot in Sumy. On August 25, for example, Ukraine ambushed the convoy carrying Russian Lieutenant General Esadullah Abachev. The general was en route to Sumy to help organize the already failing summer offensive in that region, only for him to be maimed in a Ukrainian drone attack. Interestingly, Ukraine preceded that strike by destroying a bridge close to Unakivka. That suggests what is now seen in the village is the result of several weeks of hard work by Ukraine's forces to isolate Russia's soldiers. The Guardian adds that Ukraine has also conducted strikes against several trains that were supposed to provide supplies to Russian troops operating in Sumy, again showcasing a smart strategy of cutting Russia's forces off from what they need to launch assaults. This systematic destruction of supply lines is working wonders in Sumy. Now, Russia's soldiers in Unakivka are paying the price. It was mentioned earlier that Ukraine has turned that village into a kill zone, though not the type that one might expect. The country has talked about drone-based kill zones in the past, with the theory being that it uses multiple layers of drones to create no man's lands across the front lines. In September, RBC Ukraine reported that Ukraine was planning to create an 18.6-mile kill zone across the front, for instance. Loaded with drones, that kill zone would serve both as an early warning system for Ukraine's defenders and a means to destroy Russian soldiers before they ever get close to the territory they're trying to take. Ukraine seems to have created a smaller version of this type of kill zone around Unakivka. But where it's starting to use kill zones elsewhere, as a complement to assaults designed to retake occupied territory, the kill zone in Unakivka is all about making it impossible for the trapped soldiers to escape. That in turn means that Ukraine doesn't have to go on the attack in the village. Euromaidan Press explains why Ukraine doesn't want to do that. Unakivka's open layout with scattered and burned out buildings offers no cover and no reason for the Ukrainians to engage in a storming operation, which would only cost losses in an attritional battle that can hardly be won against an opponent with more troops on the ground, the outlet says. Ukraine has no interest in fighting what could be a losing battle to reclaim its lost village. So, as mentioned earlier, it's taking advantage of the Russian desire to hold on to every scrap of territory it claims. Let Russia keep Unakivka, Ukraine seems to be saying. Why? Russia soldiers are trapped. They can't leave because Ukraine's drones will kill them, and with their supply lines cut off, Ukraine doesn't even have to attack. Ukraine just has to wait the Unakivka occupiers out. Or, perhaps more accurately, starve those occupiers until they have no choice other than surrender or die. Euromaidan Press says that Ukraine knows that it has the advantage everywhere except in terms of pure numbers of soldiers in Unakivka. It also points out that Russia's forces have already tried to push out of Unakivka, only to have that push destroyed by Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is essentially holding Russia's soldiers in place, keeping them imprisoned in the village they were once so proud to claim. In doing so, Ukraine is also able to use troops that it would have sent to fight for Unakivka elsewhere in Sumy, all as the Russian soldiers in that village wait for help that will probably never come. Eventually, those troops will starve, and for many in Ukraine, that will be a form of poetic justice. After all, Russia has a history of using starvation as a tactic against Ukraine. Only, Russia wasn't starving Ukraine's soldiers, instead it targeted civilians. In June 2024, CNN reported that a group of international human rights lawyers had accused Russia of using starvation tactics against the civilians of Mariupol during the 85-day siege of that city in 2022. The findings were part of a 76-page report that detailed how Russia has systematically attacked objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Those objects include electricity substations and water supplies, the latter of which was a serious problem for Mariupol civilians. Without water, they couldn't drink, and struggled to make many of the flour-based staples that made up their diets. It could be said that Ukraine is giving Russia's soldiers a taste of their own medicine in Unakivka. However, it looks like those soldiers aren't getting a chance to taste much of anything thanks to Ukraine's trap. That trap, Euromaidan Press says, has been built along the road between Unakivka and another Sumy settlement named Sudza. Additionally, forested settlements that lead into Unakivka are now carpeted with drones and within the sights of Ukraine's artillery. Any Russian soldiers who try to escape Unakivka via any of these routes won't last long. Ukraine is also securing the region south of the road it's already claimed, which allows it to create ambush sites that can also take out any escaping Russians. Ultimately, the trap comes down to control. The more of the forested area around Unakivka that Ukraine occupies, the fewer the options Russia has for evacuating its trapped soldiers. All Ukraine has left to do is secure and fortify the nearby settlement of Yablunivka, and the trap will be complete. After that's done, the kill zone will become inescapable. Ukraine won't ever have to attack Unakivka. It can just wait out the Russian soldiers there, forcing them to either surrender or engage in suicidal escape attempts. By this point, a natural question arises. What does all of this have to do with Putin abandoning his troops? The obvious answer is that Russia is doing very little to rescue the Unakivka forces from Ukraine. Granted, Ukraine is making such a rescue very difficult with its encirclement of the village, but Russia doesn't even seem to be trying. It's almost as if Putin has given up the village and the soldiers inside as a lost cause as he focuses elsewhere in Sumy. However, there's more to it than that, Euromaidan Press claims. It says that Ukraine is finding plenty of evidence that Russia is doing little to help any of its Sumy soldiers, be they in Unakivka or the nearby areas that Ukraine is currently clearing. Among the dead, Ukrainians found a phone filled with messages and videos of Russian troops complaining of hunger, no rotation, and commanders ignoring their pleas, the outlet says. Euromaidan Press reveals the contents of some of these videos and messages. It says that many of the Russian soldiers in Unakivka now talk about never-ending drone attacks and uncaring commanders who order them to engage in counterattacks in the surrounding areas. Those counterattacks never work. The soldiers sent into them rarely come back. Dwindling supplies are another major issue, as already discussed. Not even surrender seems to be an option. The outlet recounts one video in which a pair of Russian soldiers are attempting to leave Unakivka so they can surrender to Ukraine's troops. They never come close to making it. As they start walking toward the Ukrainian lines with their hands raised in the air, Russian drones fly above and drop explosive munitions on them to prevent the surrender. That is brutal, and that is Putin's military. It's no wonder that the trapped Unakivka soldiers feel that there's no hope for them. They're getting killed for attempting to surrender, and this is far from the first time that's happened. Back in October 2023, the BBC reported that US officials accused Russia of executing its own soldiers if they attempted to retreat from the bloody battle for Avdiivka. That battle saw Russia lose 5,000 soldiers, 125 armoured vehicles, and an entire battalion's worth of equipment before the settlement fell. However, it's the executions of its own that stand out. This comes back to what was mentioned earlier about Russia's desperation to hold on to any territory that it gains. If the country's commanders were willing to kill their own soldiers when trying to capture a settlement, there is no realistic chance that they would allow their troops to then abandon a village. Russia's soldiers exist to fight and die, at least in Putin's mind. And that, combined with Russia seeming to have no inclination to launch a rescue attempt in Unakivka, is how Putin is abandoning his own soldiers. That explains how, but there's a big question to answer. Why? The answer may be that Putin simply doesn't care about his soldiers. That's according to Ukraine's foreign minister, Andrei Sybiha. In June, Sybiha took to X to respond to several of Putin's claims, with one about Russia's own soldiers really standing out. But of all of Putin's deranged statements today, one about the Russian soldier's foot stands out. In reality, wherever a Russian soldier sets foot, he brings along only death, destruction, and devastation, Sybiha said. Putin doesn't care about Russian soldiers on their feet torn apart by Ukrainian drones. He's a mass murderer of his own people. He already disposed 1 million Russian soldiers in a senseless bloodbath in Ukraine without achieving a single strategic goal. 1 million soldiers, 2 million feet. Sybiha's comments were made in response to an earlier Putin claim that anywhere a Russian soldier sets foot belongs to Russia. I've said it before, Russians and Ukrainians are one people, Putin exclaimed. In this sense, all of Ukraine is ours. There's an old rule that wherever a Russian soldier sets foot, that's ours. Ukraine's foreign minister is pointing out how ridiculous that claim is, especially as so many of Russia's soldiers are dying on land that is supposedly theirs. And dying is what Russia's soldiers are doing, in droves. Sybiha says 1 million Russians are casualties of the Ukraine war, but the number has grown substantially since then. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance highlights that, reporting that Russia has lost 1,123,950 of its soldiers between when Putin launched his invasion and October 13. On October 12 alone, 1,140 Russian soldiers were sacrificed for Putin's ambition, and there'll be many more thousands, perhaps even millions to come, as Putin shows no sign of stopping. Russia's leader is happy to pay the price for Ukraine in the blood of his own soldiers. And the terrible truth is that Russia is still a long way away from getting what it wants. According to Al Jazeera, Russia currently controls approximately 20% of Ukraine's territory. While much of that territory was captured during the initial stages of the invasion, even an approximation of how much that territory has cost Russia reflects very poorly on Putin's strategy. For every percent of Ukraine that Russia has gained, Putin has allowed around 56,197 of his soldiers to be wounded, killed, or captured. There is still 80% of Ukraine to go. If Russia posts the same kinds of numbers to take the rest of Ukraine, it will have lost another 4,495,800 of its soldiers by the time Ukraine is fully under Russian control. That isn't sustainable. But it also doesn't matter to Putin because any gains, no matter how small, are worth the sacrifice. That's according to Politico, which wrote on October 13 that Russia is absolutely bleeding troops for what it calls microscopic gains. During the first 8 months of 2025, the outlet says, Russia has lost 281,550 soldiers to death, injury, or capture. But what's really disturbing is the claim made by a joint report between Media Zona and the BBC that reveals that Russia's rate of deaths to injury is far worse than expected. Due to the lack of a normal system of evacuating the wounded from the battlefield, there are only 1.3 wounded soldiers per 1 dead, the report says. This signals a low level of survival of the wounded, who are poorly trained in tactical medicine and are usually abandoned without help after injury. The lack of a system for evacuating soldiers tells the whole story about what's happening in Unakivka. Putin isn't leaving those soldiers to die because Russia can't break through Ukraine's lines to get them, even with Ukraine making that breakthrough as difficult as possible. An evacuation isn't happening because Putin and his cronies care so little about their soldiers that they haven't even bothered to come up with any defined plans on how to evacuate them when they're injured. Why should Putin bother with that? There are millions more Russians he can send to the front lines to replace those that he abandoned. And that thought process leads to the root of why Putin is happy to abandon soldiers who are stuck in Ukraine's trap. Russia's president sees his soldiers as little more than cannon fodder. To him, the trapped Unakivka troops are little more than a potential distraction for Ukraine that might allow Russia to make advances elsewhere. Even with Ukraine taking the slow and steady approach in Unakivka, it's still dedicating soldiers to encircling the settlement. Ukraine still has to use drones and artillery to cut off escape routes. These are all resources that Ukraine can't deploy anywhere else in Sumy, and that's all that Putin really sees. The abandoned troops can die for all Putin cares. At least, that means Ukraine has spent another bullet or bomb. Putin's treatment of his soldiers as cannon fodder was highlighted in an article Leon Aron wrote for The Spectator in October 2024. He pointed out that Russia is now raiding prisons and calling on its youngest people to fight in Ukraine, knowing that many of those he sends will never make it back. Aron concludes his article with a question. How many thousands, or more likely tens of thousands of boys will be killed before Russia begins to oppose the war? Aron asks. For now, no amount of protest from Russia's mothers and wives will stop the Kremlin from turning legions of their husbands and sons into cannon fodder. The soldiers in Unakivka are just numbers to add to those that Putin has already sacrificed. They've outlived their usefulness as an attacking threat, so Putin is happy to let them die. However, there's something about Putin's callous nature that he doesn't seem to know. Abandoning soldiers undermines Russia's combat strength. The Guardian's Jack Watling made that point back in March 2022, and his words have proven prophetic. Russia's ruthless treatment of its own soldiers, while concealable at a small scale, has now brought about operational repercussions, Watling wrote. He went on to point out that Putin and his cronies had failed to tell their soldiers how they were going to wage war after the initial invasion failed. That left Russia with an army that was unprepared, both logistically and psychologically, to fight the kind of war it's now fighting. Planning went out the window, and the slow pace of advance seen following the initial invasion was symptomatic of a military that doesn't care about the people who make it tick. Nothing has changed in the 3.5 years since Watling wrote those words. Russia's pace of advance is still glacial, it's losing more soldiers than ever before, and Putin doesn't seem to care. That's why there's no hope for the Russian troops trapped in Unakivka. By design, Putin's entire war against Ukraine has revolved around sacrificing soldiers to achieve gains. The Unakivka soldiers made a small gain. Now, they're paying a terrible price because Putin refuses to allow his soldiers to do anything other than hold or fight, even when he knows they have no chance of winning. Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, governments, analysts and populations across the world have wondered when and where the Kremlin might strike next. That answer has now become clear. Russia is not going to stop at Ukraine. Its president, Vladimir Putin, has his sights set on a much larger target, the NATO alliance itself. A Russian attack on a NATO nation is inevitable and could come sooner than expected, according to one of the most experienced and trusted intelligence experts in all of Europe, Germany's spy chief Martin Jaeger. Jaeger is a man with years of experience at the highest levels of politics. He served in Germany's Federal Foreign Office and Federal Chancellery, and has held positions as Germany's State Secretary of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as its official ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, and most recently Ukraine. Earlier this year, he was appointed the president of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, BND, officially taking office on September 15, 2025, becoming just the 14th person to hold this title since the BND formed in 1956. When a man like Jaeger speaks, the world listens, and on October 13, at the annual public hearing of the presidents of the Federal Intelligence Services in the Berlin Bundestag, Jaeger had a stark and worrying warning to share with his fellow intelligence chiefs and the various lawmakers in attendance. In no uncertain terms, Jaeger stated that a Russian attack on Europe could come at any moment, and that NATO needs to be ready to respond whenever that happens. We must not sit back and assume that a possible Russian attack will not come until 2029 at the earliest. For those who have been following the story of the Russian-Ukraine war closely, these words will sound familiar. Several other leading figures across Europe have expressed similar sentiments in recent times. Earlier this year, for instance, General Alexis Grinkowicz, commander of the United States European Command and Supreme Allied Commander Europe, warned that the world could be just a couple of years away from the outbreak of World War III, suggesting that Russia and China could launch coordinated attacks as soon as 2027. Grinkowicz, like Jaeger, was speaking in Germany when he issued his warning in the US Army Europe and Africa hosted conference in Wiesbaden, to be precise, where he called on military and defense industry leaders to ramp up weapons production and development across the NATO alliance. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has also shared his belief that Russia could use military force against the NATO alliance within the coming years. Speaking at Chatham House in the United Kingdom, Rutte revealed,
"In terms of ammunition, Russia produces in 3 months what the whole of NATO produces in a year. And its defense industrial base is expected to roll out 1,500 tanks, 3,000 armored vehicles and 200 Iskander missiles this year alone. Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years."
In a later interview with the New York Times, Rutte doubled down, stating that Europeans will have to learn Russian unless they can elevate their defense spending and strengthen their militaries to be ready to deter or fend off a forthcoming Kremlin offensive. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has also repeatedly warned of the likelihood of a Russian attack against a NATO nation in the years to come. Zelensky feels that Ukraine is currently delaying Putin's plans and keeping the Kremlin war machine occupied, but that if Russia sees any sort of opportunity to test NATO's defenses, it will seize it, and NATO needs to be ready. All of these experienced leaders have spoken about a possible Russian attack against NATO sometime in the next 2 to 5 years, but Germany's head spy, Martin Jaeger, worries that the Kremlin's campaign is already underway, stating, "We are already under fire today." The BND president believes that the lines between war and peace are becoming increasingly murky, explaining, "Russia is concealing its true intentions, but in fact it's probing our borders. At best, Europe is in a state of cold peace, one that could flare into a hot confrontation at any moment. We must prepare ourselves for further escalation of the situation." Jaeger's comments echo those of the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who said on September 29, "Let me put it in a sentence that may be a little shocking at first glance. We are not at war, but we're no longer at peace either." Just like Jaeger, Merz argues that even though NATO troops are not yet on the ground fighting against Russian forces directly, and no official declaration of war has been made by either side, the relationship between the Kremlin and the NATO alliance can no longer be described as anything close to peaceful. The state of play may not be quite severe enough to be classified as war either, but sits somewhere in between the two extremes, as Russia is quite clearly taking sneaky yet solid steps to undermine the NATO alliance, destabilize European democracy, divide society, and strike fear, panic, and confusion into the general public. It does this in various ways, including the recent Russian drone incursions into NATO airspace in countries like Poland and Estonia, as well as cyber attacks, sabotage, and online disinformation campaigns. As Jaeger notes, the means Moscow uses are well known: attempted manipulation of elections and public opinion, propaganda, provocations, disinformation, espionage, sabotage, airspace violation by drones and fighter jets, contract killings, persecution of opposition figures living abroad. The spy chief continued, "The hybrid means Russia uses to achieve this are now ubiquitous. The frequency of these new individual incidents represents a new level of confrontation. a confrontation in which Russia regards us as an adversary and a belligerent party. He went on to express his belief that Germany represented Russia's primary target in Europe, given the fact that it's the largest of all European Union nations and has played such a prominent role in supporting Ukraine throughout the war so far. Arguing that Russia is intent on expanding its sphere of influence, Jaeger claimed, "To achieve this goal, Russia will not shy away from direct military confrontation with NATO if necessary." Sinan Selen, president of the German Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, BFV, agrees, calling Russia the main perpetrator in the preparation and implementation of acts of sabotage in Germany and other European countries. Selen went on to condemn Moscow's actions as undoubtedly aggressive, offensive, and increasingly escalatory, adding, "Russia is aggressively pursuing its political ambitions against Germany, the EU, and its Western allies. Russian services continuously adjust the levels of escalation of their activities with a strategic aim of weakening liberal democracies. As a result, we detect a wide range of espionage, disinformation, interference, sabotage, and cyber attacks conducted by foreign actors and states in Germany." There's plenty of evidence to back this up, with the most obvious examples being the aforementioned cases of Russian drones flying beyond Ukraine and into the airspace of NATO nations. Most notably, on September 10, more than 20 drones travelled all the way across Ukraine and onward into Poland. Soon after, the Polish Air Force, along with several NATO allies, scrambled aircraft and shot down several of the drones, with the Polish government going on to invoke Article 4 of the NATO treaty. Numerous world leaders expressed shock and horror in the wake of the incident, and NATO responded rapidly with the announcement of Operation Eastern Sentry on September 12, a new initiative aimed at strengthening the alliance's eastern flank, involving air, sea and ground assets from multiple member nations deployed all across Eastern Europe. Only a day later, Romania was also forced to scramble fighter jets of its own after detecting a drone in its airspace at the same time as a Russian attack was taking place on Ukrainian infrastructure not far from the nation's border. Again, mere days later, yet another incident occurred, with 3 Russian MiG-31 fighter jets reportedly entering Estonian airspace for a period of 12 minutes, according to the Estonian Foreign Ministry. This incursion occurred over the Gulf of Finland and was not the first, but in fact the 4th time that Russia had violated Estonian airspace in 2025 alone, with the foreign minister stating, "Russia has already violated Estonia's airspace 4 times this year, which in itself is unacceptable, but today's incursion, involving 3 fighter aircraft entering our airspace, is unprecedentedly brazen." Kremlin officials have repeatedly either denied any involvement in these incidents or claimed that they were mere accidents or misunderstandings. But many experts and world leaders are no longer willing to listen to Russia's lies and propaganda, with Zelensky summing it up well when he said, "Russian military personnel know exactly where their drones are headed and how long they can stay in the air. The routes are always calculated. This cannot be an accident, a mistake, or the initiative of some lower-level commanders. It's a deliberate expansion of the war by Russia. This is how they operate. Small steps at first, and in the end, great losses." There have also been additional suspicious incidents in recent weeks involving alleged Russian drones being spotted above other European nations, including Germany itself, as well as Denmark, Norway, Finland and Lithuania. Between September 22 and 28, for example, unexplained unmanned aircraft were seen on a nightly basis near both civilian airports and military installations across Norway and Denmark, forcing major airports, like those in Copenhagen and Oslo, to temporarily shut down. Meanwhile, in Germany, on September 26, reports emerged of multiple drone sightings in the northern state of Schleswig-Holstein. German authorities shared their suspicions that the drones may be involved in espionage activities. A day later, on September 27, another suspicious drone was sighted near a power plant in Finland, near Rovaniemi. And that very same day, 3 drones were also seen in the air around Vilnius airport in Lithuania, causing several commercial flights to be delayed. While there hasn't been any official confirmation that these drones all came from Russia or were part of the Kremlin's campaign to spy on, interfere in and disrupt European society, the timing and nature of the incidents is highly suspicious, to say the least. It cannot be a mere coincidence that so many airspace violations and unusual drone activities have taken place all within such a short span of time. Instead, many military analysts and leaders feel confident that these events are all linked and all tied back to the same place, Moscow. And it's not just through drones that the Kremlin is waging its hidden war against the NATO alliance. Looking back over the last 18 months, there's also evidence of possible Russian sabotage taking place within Germany itself, focused on military production facilities. Between April 2024 and October 2025, 3 suspicious incidents all took place. First, on May 3, 2024, a fire broke out at the Deal Metal Applications facility in Berlin. The facility supplied Iris-T missiles used in Iris-T SLS and SLM missile systems, several of which have been sent to Kyiv to help defend Ukraine against Russian aggression. The fire caused heavy structural damage at the factory, and while German authorities have not officially confirmed sabotage, Western media outlets, citing unnamed officials, reported suspicions that Russian operatives may have been involved. Investigators and insurers pointed to a technical fault as the likely cause, but some analysts believe the incident fit a broader pattern of suspected Russian efforts to disrupt Western arms production and deliveries to Ukraine. Only a few months later, in July 2024, German and American authorities foiled a Russian plot to assassinate the CEO of Rheinmetall, the biggest arms manufacturer in Germany and one of the largest in all of Europe, producing a variety of armored fighting vehicles and personnel carriers, among other equipment like anti-aircraft defense systems, naval vessels, artillery, mortars, and tank guns. The target of the assassination plan was Armin Pappberger, chairman of the Rheinmetall Executive Board, who has played an instrumental role in ensuring that Ukraine has the weapons it needs to defend its territory and fend off Russia's relentless frontline assaults. Fortunately, the plot to end Pappberger's life was found out and nullified, but this showed just how far Russia was willing to go in its shadow war with the West, with one NATO official at the time stating, "We're seeing sabotage, we're seeing assassination plots, we're seeing arson, we're seeing things that have a cost in human lives. I believe very much that we're seeing a campaign of covert sabotage activities from Russia that have strategic consequences." The third and final Russia-linked incident in Germany came on June 26 of this year, when fires broke out in a suspected arson attack in the city of Erfurt. There, multiple Rheinmetall manned military trucks were set ablaze, and pro-Russian Telegram channels celebrated the incident and claimed responsibility. Reporting tied the attack to Russian operatives, though German authorities have not publicly confirmed Russian authorship, and police have since opened a sabotage investigation. In the previous 18 months, stretching back to 2022, only one similarly suspicious incident was recorded in the German defense industry, a cyber attack on Rheinmetall's civilian and industrial division headquarters in Dusseldorf in April 2023. Attribution was linked to the Black Basta ransomware group, and German authorities did not officially pin the operation on Russian hackers, though analysts noted that the attack aligned with other Kremlin-affiliated cyber tactics. Germany has also made several arrests of Russian nationals relating to activities of sabotage and espionage since the war started, with one Russian arrested in Munich in January of this year over a plot to sabotage German tank production. More than 10 Russia-linked suspects have also been detained between 2024 and 2025, and this sort of thing is not only happening in Germany. Far and wide across Europe and within NATO member states' borders, Russia has been engaged in a long-running and multi-layered sabotage campaign, doing everything from targeting the supply lines of weapons for Ukraine to disrupting the course of democracy. Numerous security officials across Europe have highlighted this threat, citing incidents of Russian agents paying off local people to carry out risky crimes on the Kremlin's behalf. One NATO official noted an unprecedented escalation and spread of Russia's hybrid warfare, specifically involving physical sabotage of the supply lines of NATO weapons set to be delivered to Ukraine. They stated, "It's everything from point of production and origin to storage, to those who are making decisions, to the actual delivery. It's bold. Russia is attempting to intimidate our allies." And Russia is not afraid to use any and all possible tactics to achieve its ends. One incident, for example, involved Russian agents recruiting young men in Poland, contacting them over Telegram and paying them small amounts of digital currencies in exchange for completing various tasks. Those tasks range from relatively trivial matters like spraying graffiti messages around Polish cities to more serious crimes like planting surveillance cameras beside military bases and humanitarian aid routes or burning down Ukrainian-owned properties. Polish police and internal security forces have also tracked down and arrested other people acting on the orders of Russian handlers, with one even involved in a suspected assassination plot on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The same sort of thing is happening in other nations. In France, for example, a 26-year-old pro-Russian Ukrainian was arrested after detonating a homemade bomb near the Charles de Gaulle airport in Paris. In the United Kingdom, 5 men were convicted for a Russian-ordered arson attack on a London warehouse that was filled with supplies destined for Ukraine. There was also said to be massive Russian interference in the recent parliamentary elections in Moldova, with over 70 people arrested by the authorities after they were found to have been sent to Serbia and trained by Russian instructors in how to cause division, provoke the public, and resist arrest. Those involved were paid several hundred euros for their involvement and were set to be used as pawns in Russia's game to yet again interfere in another country's fair and free electoral process. Fortunately, this plan was found out and foiled by the authorities, and intelligence services across NATO have upped their game when it comes to exchanging information and helping one another find out about Russian plots and stop them in their tracks. They're doing whatever they can to beat the Kremlin at its own game, to snuff out any and all traces of Russian disruption and interference. But they can't be everywhere at once, and there's no telling how many Russian agents could be acting across Europe at this very moment, unseen and unheard, sowing the seeds of chaos. Online too, Russian hackers and botnets pose a massive threat, as they're able to spread extraordinary amounts of disinformation, shaping narratives and influencing opinions far and wide. And this all brings us back to Martin Jaeger, who admits that Russia's spies operate in ways that make it very difficult to trace an attribute, and that they're evidently doing whatever they can to influence German domestic politics and government decision-making, as well as influencing and interfering in other nations across Europe. In response, Jaeger argues it's vital for the European Union and the NATO alliance to stand firm and fight back. Now, in his view, is the time for strength and decisiveness. At the same time, restraint and leniency are interpreted as weakness by our opponents such as Russia. We must draw the right conclusions from this. We must confront our opponents wherever necessary. To this end, we will take higher risks in a controlled and consistent manner. Jaeger's overall message is clear. A hot confrontation between Russia and NATO could erupt at any moment, and he warns that the alliance is already under fire. It may not involve bombs and missiles just yet, with Russia instead using more surreptitious methods to achieve its devious goals. But the Kremlin is quite clearly in the process of undermining NATO in whatever ways it can think of. In response, the alliance cannot simply sit still and watch as its weaknesses are identified and exploited by the enemy. It must be strong, resilient, and ready to retaliate. Now, learn more about how Russia is running scared of the latest evolution in German military hardware, a next-generation tank killer that can turn Russian armor into mere confetti. Or, for a more of a big-picture look at how the war is progressing and what the coming months may hold, check out our in-depth breakdown of how Ukraine has slowly but surely turned the tide of the battle and how it may now be ready to push on towards victory. And finally, be sure to subscribe to our channel too, for more informative and insightful videos detailing the latest military news and developments from the front lines of Ukraine and other important locations across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and beyond.